minute. Okay, so sorry about the delay in getting this darn thing going. My name is Andrew Predmore. I just started working with Last Call Media last month. I have been working almost exclusively with Drupal for at least a decade, and presenting here and there for a while. Hence the rabble rousers in the back row, the groupies. So how this came about, the Respect the Classics, is 3 or 4 years ago at NED Camp, the New England Drupal Camp, which was in Rhode Island that year. One of the keynote speaker mentioned the Cathedral and the Bazaar, and she asked, "Well, how many people have read it?" And I was the only one that raised my hand. And I said, "Well, that's crazy. I mean, most of you have heard of this book, but you haven't read it." And so I kind of decided that I want to do a rant about, you kids these days that haven't heard of all this stuff, and you're trying to reinvent the wheel and, implement web servers and JavaScript, all that. So I toned it down a little bit, and it's not going to be like a Lewis Black, tear my hair out presentation. But that's the general gist, is that there are books, some of these books are almost 40 years old, that describe the same problems that other people are talking about in presentations today at this camp. And so it's hilarious, not hilarious, but it is funny how the same problems keep coming up again and again, and people keep rediscovering them. Hopefully you'll get a better feeling, a comfortable feeling that you're not alone, and maybe even be inspired to read some of these books. I actually brought some physical ones along. Anybody seen these things? They're called books. Yeah. Wow. They're printed on paper. I had a bigger stack, but I'm not going to carry that around on my backpack. Another thing about me is, about 4 years ago, I gave up on slides, because most of the time the presenter's just reading from the slide or repeating the same information. So that is different too. It's more like a TED Talk or something. There's all beautiful pictures. But yeah, well, I put up pictures and stuff, but I might get inspired to write on the board. Yeah, old school, I know. So let's start with the Cathedral and the Bazaar. This book, written by Eric S. Raymond. This was written a long time ago. I didn't actually put the publication dates down in my notes, but this was written during the founding, 1999. So, in internet terms, that's ancient history, 19 years ago. And the book was posted in 99, but he actually wrote the essays in it several years before that. It was during the foundation of Linux and the GNU project. And the first essay, The Cathedral and the Bazaar, is an economic study about open source. Because back in the 80s and 90s, the idea that people would give away their work for free was an extremely radical idea, like out there radical idea. And he basically wrote it as an economic study of how this was even possible, that programmers could make a living writing programs and then giving those programs to everybody for free, right? And we're so comfortable with that now because we work, even if you work in a large company, a Microsoft or something like that, or an Apple, they still use so many open source tools that we're all comfortable with that idea. But in the back then, he made the argument that it was possible that you could write the code, give it away, it would be better code, it would be stronger codes, more secure code, and that you could make your money by give away the tool, but make your money by using the tool to build things, right? And so everything that we do in this conference, you have to give at least some credit to him for making the argument that this is even possible. And then he wrote another essay. There's several essays in these books. Some of these are fairly academic books. He called it Homesteading the Noosphere. Homesteading. And again, this was prescient, absolutely clairvoyant on his part. If you know what homesteading is, if you've seen the films of the Oregon land rush, people literally sat on the border of Oregon with their covered wagons, and at noon a person shoots off a gun and the people just race into Oregon and go 20 miles in and stake their claim and build a farm, right? Because it was, politics about Native Americans aside, it was officially open land, according to them, right? And so he predicted that there was a huge world out there, and he called it the noosphere, right? But we call it the internet or the web or whatever you want. But he predicted there's this huge, enormous country that we haven't discovered yet back in the 90s, right? And he said there are companies just rushing into this and staking huge claims, right, to entertainment, to shopping, to web search, and you all know who I'm talking about, right? Because these companies did stake claims, and Google and Apple and Microsoft just became these giant behemoths that that look like the oligarchy of the turn of the last century. The giant steel barons and stuff that homesteaded and built these things. So it's a fascinating read because it's still, well, it's amazing how much he got right, so far back. So that's one. Design patterns. Let's get this one's this one's a general read. It's academic, right? And some of the essays are better quality than others, right? But anybody could read this one. This one's dense. This is Design Patterns by the Gang of Four. There are 4 authors, right? And the idea of a design, well, actually, let me stay with my notes so I don't get off. I will read you a quote from the preface, right? It says, "A word of warning and encouragement. Don't worry if you don't understand this book completely on the first reading. We didn't understand it all on the first writing." Right? Remember that this isn't a book to read once and put on a shelf. We hope you'll find yourself referring to it again and again for design insights and for inspiration. So that's a warning, and it is true. I don't think I've ever read this book cover to cover, right? It can't take it in bite-sized chunks. The idea of a design pattern came from architecture. And again, another quote from the very beginning. And it's not just because I read the beginning. I'm not like some high school student that just read the first chapter and I'm trying to make it. But that's where the introductions come. So Christopher Alexander said, each pattern describes a problem which occurs over and over again in our environment, and then describes the core of the solution to that problem in such a way that you can use the solution 1,000,000 times over without ever doing it the same way twice. Now, the thing about Christopher Alexander was he was an architect and a civil engineer. So when he introduced the concept of design patterns, he was talking about what is the best way to design an entryway for people that are going in and out in large crowds, right? So if you think about a movie theater or a football stadium or something like that, there's going to be a design pattern for how to move the people in and out of that building in a certain way. And it's going to be similar no matter whether it is, an opera house or a soccer stadium, right? And every other kind of thing you have to think about, moving water or electricity or things through a building, there's going to be a design pattern. And after you know the pattern, you can apply it over and over again. It doesn't mean architecture in the sense of, what particular period style you're trying to imitate, but how to repeat the function, right? How to repeat the function. Well, these guys took it and they applied they identified 4 dozen design patterns in programming that come up over and over and over again. And they give examples in various different object-oriented languages of how to implement these. One example is an iterator. And this one is so primitive that it's actually built into some languages, like the .NET languages. An iterator simply goes from one thing to another. So if you have an array of objects, it just is a way to say, give me the next one, give me the next one, give me the next one, right? But an iterator can be applied to something like a hierarchical menu structure, where you might have, I can't draw a menu today, right? Where you might have multiple levels with it off it, and you say, give me the next page in the book, next page in the book, and then you drop down and give me the next page. So you're jumping around, but you're still iterating. All you're doing is saying, give me next, right? And so they show the code, right, so that you can design an iterator, a thing that just goes from step to step. And like I said, this one is so simple that some languages like Java and .NET actually have an iterator interface that you can implement as part of your code, right? And their arrays and their nodes and everything already use those things, right? But then they describe something called a strategy, right? And these things often have more than one name, right? Strategy, as they describe it in the book, it doesn't sound like it's not a very good description, actually, but a strategy is define a family of algorithms, encapsulate each one, and make them interchangeable. Strategy lets the algorithms vary independently from clients that use it. So an example of a strategy, if you're come from the Drupal world, is I want to use a different database, right? And Drupal allows you to say, switch from MySQL to Mongo, which are completely different databases on the back end, but you can just swap them in and out independently because of that. Or if I want to use a different caching backend, right? Or I wanted to use a different search engine, right? Drupal allows you to swap those pieces out in and out quite easily, and that's a strategy. So a lot of the things that that you see when you get into advanced programming is, this book again was written quite a while ago. It's in here, right? And there's a solution already to the problem you're trying to solve. Now, Drupal went completely object-oriented after years of debate and controversy in Drupal 8, right? And the best place to learn, now some of the things I described are in Drupal in various ways, but the best thing to read if you really want to pick up this book and understand some of the things people have the most trouble with in Drupal are the things that are called dependency injection and plugins. If you've seen those and tried them, and then like, okay, I did the code example and I still have no idea why I did that, which, believe me, I've been through this too, right? The very first part of the book is a bunch of creational patterns, right? And they describe abstract factories and factory methods and builders and prototypes and singletons. And all of those things are what Drupal is doing in the back end. They're calling them different things. They're calling them dependency injection. They're calling them, interfaces and things like that. But they're the exact same thing, where instead of making things that are very, very highly structured and very rigid, you can make a class and then pull in the thing you need, right, and inject it into your class, right? And so that if you look at the creational patterns, so of this section of this book, and then play around with Drupal, after about a year, it all makes sense. So let's see. Yeah. So there's that one. What's next? I'm doing this quick because, and I'm not going to go too deep into everyone, but Mythical Man Month. This is the one where I tend to rant or start my rant. This book was written 40 years ago. This is the 25th anniversary edition, and I bought it like 15 years ago. The Mythical Man Month was a deep retrospective from a guy at Microsoft, because Microsoft built a great operating system and a bunch of great software, and then they got an insane amount of money, and they tried to build it, the next round, and they just bloated beyond comprehension. you know, they tried to plug in every feature that they ever could, and and try to get it all done. And the some of the things were an absolute failure. The second version of Excel, I believe, was never even released. I think they had to scrap it. You know, Windows 98 was a not pretty thing. You know, so that's this is a sort of retrospective after he left. The key in this one is that when you have an enormous project, not even enormous, when you have a big project with a big team, all right, let's see, well, not even a big team. Let's start with 4. When you have 4 people, there's a bunch of different ways these people can communicate with each other, right? You add another, now if you're running out of time and you need more people to work on this project, well, let's add 2 more, right? But now these people add so many other lines, right? Look at how fast that's going up. The level of communication and in interchange of information among the team goes up exponentially. I mean, that went up twice as many different lines of communication just by adding 2 people. And so this observation, that's why it's called the mythical man month. The idea that you can just throw resource hours at a problem because you're behind schedule is nonsense. And we all know this. We've all been through this on a project that's running behind time, and they bring in more and more people. It doesn't really help, right? And so we've seen this even in other presentations today. One of the things he proposed, which is, again, these aren't for the presentation. These notes are notes. I got so excited about these books, I started writing in them. Yeah, so he proposes a model of a chief surgeon in a hospital, right? So, so the chief surgeon may do surgery, right, and is an expert in his field, but then he has this amazing support staff, right, of administration on one side, secretaries, right, editors, you know, and other people, and then he has other people, another surgeon, a top-level surgeon. In this case, it would be a scheduler, a toolsmith, so a person that works with the different tools, surgical tools that he might work. So if one of his machines isn't working, right, and a tester, and a lawyer, and all kinds of people that support the surgeon, right? So you take the parallel is a dedicated developer, right, has to have a team around them, not of other developers necessarily, but support people that are experts in making sure that he can focus on what he's best at, right? So some of the problems identified in this book have been solved, or else the open source model I mentioned earlier would not work. I mean, again, I work mostly in Drupal. Drupal has 13,000 contributors, something insane like that. Obviously, they don't all talk to each other, and they don't all work in the same field. So some of the things he proposed in the book, back then, if you had a computer program, everybody was supposed to know every function in that program, which in the case of a giant operating system like Microsoft's Windows, or an incredibly complicated spreadsheet software like Excel, was impossible, right? I mean, he even describes earlier efforts on IBM things where they were printing the entire code base every few days because it changed, and and binding it. The stacks were like this. I'm not kidding. They were stacks and stacks of paper this tall. So part of the solution that he hints at in this book is that, of course, nowadays we use incredibly modular software where you have no idea what it's doing behind the bow. You ask it something and you expect a certain value back, right? And so we use APIs and black boxes. And in Drupal, the case we use Symfony. We build on top of somebody else's code. And I work on Drupal and I write modules. I have no idea how Symfony works. I don't have to, thank God. You know, so some of the problems he'd identified, because this is 40-year-olds, have been solved. But the initial problem of trying to get a lot of people up to speed on a project is still a problem today. And it's still one that even experienced companies often just because I actually interviewed at a big company who's, name I won't mention, but it's a giant Drupal host that begins with an A. Right? I interviewed there and I mentioned that book, and the person who would have been my boss said, "What's that?" I said, "Okay, this interview is over." Literally. That was when I said, I'm not going to work for you if you haven't even heard of this book. That's a problem. So, now this one it was very technical and academic. It is a bit of a slog to read, although it is worth it. You don't have to, though. Oh, come on. You're going to time out on me? Or did I bump something?
I think every time you put a book down, it joggles the
Picky little bugger. Okay. Conveniently, most of the insights and solutions I still got one more physical book, that he wrote about, most of the solutions were written in a very accessible way by a man named Tom DeMarco and Timothy Lister, and they wrote Peopleware, right? And Peopleware, if you're going to choose any of the books to read that I'm presenting today, read this one, right? This one is not about a particular code or a particular platform or a particular technology. It's not even about managing projects. It's just about people, managing people, and it's not even about managing people and technology. This is often recommended to people outside of technology. It's just how to handle a group of talented people and keep them working, right? It mostly provides an understanding of what people that work in a creative field, and technology is a creative field. That's a big misunderstanding outside of there. But programming and engineering and all that is more creative than it is logical and cold. We're not Vulcans, And how creative people work, what they actually do, and most of what creative people do is not programming or technology itself. Right? It's communication and getting a brilliant idea and thinking about a problem. And so if you want to choose any of these, read this one, because you'll be nodding your head. It's not that thick, and you can read it at a normal pace, just like you're reading fiction. It's not dense. You could finish this in a day or two, and you'll nod your head the whole time, like, "Oh yeah, I've seen that. Oh yeah."
What's the title of that one?
What?
What's the title?
That one's Peopleware. Peopleware. So, and then the same guy, Tom DeMarco, wrote a book called Slack. If you're in any company, if you were in the presentation earlier about traffic, right? He actually brought this up very briefly, right? But if you're in any company where the backlog is out of control and and everybody's frustrated and the clients are getting mad, buy this and hand it to your boss and say, "Read this." That one's even thinner and easier to read than Peopleware. So even your boss can read it, understand it, right? And that one is all about the fact that you cannot drive a person 100% of the time just focusing on code. Long term, you're going to burn out that individual person, but over the entire company, you have no room to make things better if you drive everybody that hard. You need to have slack inside of your company so that they have the creative ideas that make everything better, or they are supporting the tools. And there have been multiple presentations. There'll be multiple presentations this weekend about things like Docker and DevOps, right? If there aren't people that have time to experiment with that and play with that and enjoy themselves, because that's what we all want to, we all want to do that a little bit. I know at some point we got to do the things the client asked, but we also want to have a little fun too. But those are the things where we will enjoy exploring a new subject, and B, provide the tool that will make us 10 times faster. And without the slack, without any ability to pick up, to provide slack, that can't happen. Now, the one thing I'll say about writing all by himself is he makes the mistake of thinking that his audience is as enthusiastic as him about what he's talking about, which is a common mistake. And he leaves at the very last chapter, he does a chapter about estimating, right? Which I don't know a single person that doesn't cringe when they're asked for an estimate, because they're going to be held to it, and you never know. And he brilliantly points out that any task has a degree of confidence in whether you know what's going to happen and what the problem is, right? And a degree of difficulty, and then a risk of something going wrong. So an estimate literally cannot be a single number, right? And he says that any task really has to be an estimate of, okay, if it goes perfectly, I can do it here. On average, a task like that would take this long. But if something but there's so many unknowns, because we don't solve problems that have been solved before. For the most part, we're solving problems that nobody's seen, nobody's tried before. If something goes wrong or it turns out to be more complex or even impossible, who knows how long it'll take, right? So he says every estimate really has to look like this. And then your boss can say, well, okay, so let's say this is a 4-hour task, but when it goes upside down on you, when you're doing a Drupal update, I keep going back to Drupal because that's where the waters I swim in. When you're doing a Drupal security update, 99% of the time it'll take an hour to 3 hours, right? But then one time out of 5, it's going to take 12 hours. So on average, we have to say it's going to take 4 hours, right? And so when you say it's going to take 4 hours, and they're like, but the other day you did it, you just pressed 3 buttons in Pantheon and you were done in 15 minutes. Yeah, that's when it all goes right. But the estimate's still going to be 4 hours. Sorry, And so that chapter is actually useful, even though it's not about Slack. It's an incredibly useful chapter, and he leaves it till the end of the book. So if you get that book, make sure to go all the way to the end, because it's really revelatory about how estimates can only be estimates. They can never be promises. And more importantly, this is also a place where you can say, this is where we need to focus our tooling, because it should only take an hour, and we should know if it failed, right? And we should be able to roll back without the client ever even knowing that something blew up, right? And so that's when you need your continuous integration in your containers and all that other fun stuff that you're hearing about in the other presentations. You can say, yeah, when this goes wrong, it goes really sideways on us. So this is the one where we need to tighten up this curve so it looks more like this, right? So it's a great chapter. Okay. Expert C programming. This is my favorite programming book. I asked for this for Christmas when I was in my 20s. I literally asked for a copy of this. My dad owned a copy, and I had read it. This is simply about C, old school C, not C++ or C# or anything like that. And it's by a guy that helped develop the language and programmed it back in the 70s, right? It is written with so much humor, and there's so many inside stories about things that actually happened and went wrong or went right, right? That it's just a wonderful read. Anybody could just sit down and read it, and you're going to laugh at least once. There's jokes, there's illustrations. It's a wonderful book. And if you program in a C syntax language, which most of us do, JavaScript, PHP, Java, et cetera, et cetera. Most of those are C syntax languages. It does explain some of the weird quirks, like I mentioned arrays earlier. Why do arrays behave so weird on you sometimes? Sometimes if I want to get a string back, instead I get back a single character, or instead I get back a number that wasn't in there. And he explains that really well. And so if anybody here programs in hardcore C or C++ or Java, it's worth reading just because you will get a better understanding of the language you're using. But it's also worth reading just because it's actually a fun book to read. Peter van der Linden, Expert C Programming. Mastering Regular Expressions. This one is as dense, if not as dense, as the design patterns. Right? It is a slog to get through. Again, I don't think I've got through the entire thing, but I have read the entire introduction and the PHP specific parts of it. It is dense, but if you are using regular expressions, even a small one, in high volume code, you should be reading this book, because regular expressions have an enormous upfront cost, and if they are not written properly, they can be incredibly inefficient. And so a little tiny string searcher that you wrote, right, in your module or your plugin, right, it may be bogging down the entire server if you don't know what you're doing. More importantly, if you get through this book, you will find your mind will be open to tools where you've been writing long pieces of code where you pull big chunks of text out of memory and then go through it and cut it up and then cut it again. And you probably written one of these things in order to parse who knows what, looking for links inside of a piece of text, or making sure that there's secure, your HTML is secure, or pulling out email addresses. We've all done this kind of code, and if you learn this stuff, you can write a single line that will do it 100 or even 1,000 times faster than the code that you wrote. So it is worth it if you're in that area. But that is one of the few that is not generally accessible. That's the one where you have to read a few pages, maybe try an example, and then sleep on it. So, rapid application development, and I'm going to start rapid application development, which is down here. You can't see it really because of the lights. That is in there just because it's history. They were the people that invented Agile. They didn't call it Agile, but they invented Agile. It was a group at a university that said, man, we're specifying the entire project, and then we get in there, we find these little bugs, and the specification has to get thrown out the window. Is there a better way to do this? Right? And so they did it. They invented what we could now call Agile. It went through many iterations. It was called extreme programming and other things. It was called RAD, and then it was called extreme, and then now it's being called Agile. So that's just there because that's actually a pretty hard book to find, because it was only a university publication. I'm not even sure how I got my copy. I thought I'd given away. So Joel on software and smart and gets things done. Joel Spolsky writes a blog. You may have heard of it. And it covers general topics in a very approachable way. Many of the things already discussed about managing people, managing projects. He does a wonderful thing about Unicode, which we've all dealt with. And he said it's called the bare minimum thing every programmer needs to know about Unicode. All of his stuff in both of those books is available on his blog for free, but they didn't come out in order. So if you really get into it, you may want to buy the book and read them, in a cleaned up way, or you could just bounce around the blog. There are other blogs out there. Rands and Repose is another one that writes very similar. Angry Donuts, is another one. Yeah, it's a thing. And then the Pragmatic Programmer and Clean Code. These two here. These are great books. They're much more approachable than Design Patterns, right? They're easier to read, and they will teach you how to program better. And they're good if you haven't had formal training in development, which I would say at least half of us in here, maybe more, haven't. Half of us were baristas and then had to make a website, and next thing you know, we're the tech support, and then we learn over 3 or 4 years, and then then we get dragged into one of the WordPress or Drupal or something, and hey, we're programmers. So these are good ways to polish up your skills. They're also good for anybody if you need encouragement and inspiration to love code again, right? And see examples of really clean, well refactored code, right? That you've been slogging away and just get it done in ugly code, which we all do. These are good books to read to just say, okay, there is an ideal out there that we're aiming for, and so those are good books too. So I did promise I would leave room, and I didn't leave a lot for conversation, or anybody have recommendations for other things. So anything?
So
Yes.
the estimation part that you were talking
Yes.
about,
Mm-hmm.
I like it. We don't estimate at work.
Mm-hmm.
We all our stories in Jira are 1 point.
Yeah. Oh, that's
Because, yeah. Well, anyway,
Eh.
but we try to keep things scoped to less than a week.
Mm-hmm.
But I shared I
Mhm.
tweeted it to our
Mhm.
summit, a link to an article that was on Signal
Mhm.
Noise that sort of had a similar thing. I thought you might be interested in. And they were talking about how when you're planning a project, it looks like a hill. And until you get over the top of the hill, you don't really know what's on the other side of the hill. So it's really hard to do it. They have some specific things that they put in practice that aren't things that I would do, but overall it's a really neat article.
Yeah.
So, and I read it 3 months ago and I'm still thinking about it.
Yeah. So Signal Noise is an online zine, basically a magazine, and that is a good source to find these more abstract articles. And do not be too disappointed about your Jira queues if you're successful. Sean, who is higher up in my company, did a presentation earlier today, and he said he has teams that don't estimate. And sometimes they succeed, sometimes they don't. I'm actually on the support team, and we don't estimate. The client gives us something, we say, okay, I'll get started on it. That's literally what we say. So there are definitely places where estimating isn't necessary because the client pays for support hours. Right? Now, we don't want to blow it out of the water, and we will come back and say, this is going to be a problem. It's going to take us a lot longer than we thought to fix it. But we don't estimate in the beginning because we don't even know what they're asking. I've had tickets, I opened them up, did a Google search, came back and said, here's the patch. And I was done before I could even come up with an estimate. Right? Because I'm like that. You just needed to do a better Google search and you would have figured this out yourself. And then I've had other ones like, oh yeah, that'll be simple. And then boom, right? One thing I do personally is I try to keep my estimates less than half a day. If I can't break a task down to things less than half a day, then I ask somebody else come with somebody else and we say, okay, what are the things we have to do to fix this? And if I can't get it under 4 hours, we need to do more analysis to figure out what we're actually doing. A week is a bit long.
Ideally, it's not a week, but the kind of stuff that we're working on, it's harder to get it much shorter than days.
Every team is different, so that's great. Other people?
I just want to mention a great book by Horizon Students and Innovators, which has some heads nodding. He's a biographer, and his most recent book is a biography of Leonardo da Vinci. The Innovators is it's like a chronological set of essays about the progression of innovations in computer science, starting with Lovelace, who was brought up earlier in the keynote, through pretty much today. So it's very accessible, and as your subtitle for this talk was respect the classics. That's like respect your elders. It's like where is this all coming from? Who are the people? Why did they try to solve problems? What was the context?
Yeah, and that's the point of this. It isn't I know more than you. It's I've been there before. Don't do what I did. That's what these books are about. I should mention one thing because it comes up. Joel and the Eric Raymond sometimes drift a little bit into bro culture and some of the uglier parts of they're not all the way into the horrible Reddit section, but they do sometimes do things like claim that there is there are 10x programmers that are worth more 10 times as much as other ones, and some other things where they can get kind of elitist and even misogynist sometimes. So I recommend the books because like Eric Raymond is basically a nut, but he did write that essay that made a convincing argument. And I'm not talking convincing to people. I mean, MIT put their money behind his essay and stuff like that. So you can respect him for that, but his other opinions are not worth it outside of that. And Joel can get a little elitist too sometimes. So just be careful when you're wandering, if you wander around the blog and things like that. Other things? Other things? Somebody mentioned a book called Lunatics Are Running the Asylum. It's another Microsoft retrospective. That's a fun read. Sorry, the chalk's getting to me apparently. I'll have to remember that next time. Yeah, what's up?
So I just want to bring up at work. A bunch of us have started going through a book called The Imposter's Handbook. It's an online book, and it's basically just a cursory look at computer science education. So it gives you access to like computation and algorithms and big notation. Yeah. And that's been a really good way because a lot of us, I have a film degree. It's been a really good way for me to go back and fill in some of the gaps. Things that I ran into.
It's a frequently discussed thing that the imposter syndrome, which all of us suffer from. We're like, how did I get here? The thing is, as I mentioned before, once a computer program problem is solved, right, then you go to the next problem, which means the easy problems have been solved. So all of us are working on things that are probably pretty freaking hard, because somebody's already done the easy tasks, right? So, yeah, definitely, I encourage people to go through stuff like that. And again, this is the reason, because if you didn't go to school for computer engineering, you may not have heard of half of these things, right? But they're there, and many of them are very readable, and you'll be like, oh yeah, that's going to help a lot down the road. Or, okay, other people have been down this road 40 years ago, and it's still not a solved problem. So, estimating and team management is always going to be a challenge. How do we make money getting a bunch of creative people? The best analogy I've ever come up with is theater. You want a good project manager? Go find a backstage director at a big theater and say, I'll pay you 10 times as much, because those people deal with crazy creative people, insane deadlines, and they manage to pull it all together, right? And that's the best analogy. These people are making a creative product on a deadline, and it's probably the best analogy for what we do. And maybe I saw a couple people's eyes light up in there. Oh yeah, that's probably the best parallel to what happens in a program. People think of programmers like architects or engineers or security guards or whatever, and we're just automatons. But no, we're a lot more like opera divas than anything else. Anything else? Because next presenter hasn't showed up, but what? Oh, okay. Well, you have showed up. Never mind. Awesome. Did it get too much? Oh, here. Okay, that's okay. I'm done.
Thank you.